An Odd Boy, Volume 1, by Ngak'chang Rinpoche. Chapter 2, Part 4. Does Mr. Love have all his records where he's gone? Will he be able to listen to them? My mother couldn't say, and it was not really a question that could be asked. Isn't there any way we could find out? My mother looked sad and replied, "Asking about these things would make your father angry." There were no answers to that question, and it seemed as it had seemed when Alice had left for Herefordshire. I wish I could have visited Mr. Love, wherever he was, and talked with him about blues. It could have been nice for him and wonderfully educational for me. I could have learnt so much. I could have kept him company, but that is exactly what my father did not want. It must have been sad for Mr. Love. I think that he liked the little friend who called on him to hear blues and asked so many questions. The thought of poor old Mr. Love all alone in a mental hospital disquieted me for a long while. I was deeply sad that I was never able to see him again. My father started playing classical music as if it was some kind of retribution from God. "We are going to listen to music now." And he sat stone-faced, defying me to say I didn't like it. I did like it, though. I liked all kinds of music, especially if it was passionate. I really enjoyed Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries, but I was told that I could not like both the depraved row and Wagner. I was not to tell lies like that. I was a wicked child. So a person couldn't like both blues and Wagner. That seemed insane. It was probably another one of those insane rules that God made. My father often worried about my being insane. He once talked about the possibility that if I got worse, I might have to be committed to a mental hospital. I overheard it whilst sitting on the upstairs landing, listening to a heated conversation between my mother and father. My father was in full rhetorical flight. "He needs medical help. He's not normal. He spends too much time staring at nothing. If we take no action, his condition could worsen, and then there would be nothing that could be done. If this is caught in time, he could be cured." "Victor is just a boy, Ernest. These things will pass," my mother replied. "He simply has strong imagination. Going up to the next school will change for him. You will see. I believe there is no problem." My father was not convinced. After a big row one day, I decided to lock myself in the lavatory for a while. My father would sometimes start shouting at my mother for reasons which were utterly unclear. These rows were mainly my father shouting and my mother answering placidly in a tone that was more or less inaudible. His anger seemed to fill the house, and my brother Graham and I would feel the need to escape. This time the row seemed to involve me, and now I realised that many of the rows may have been about me. He was infuriated that I'd locked myself in the toilet and was refusing to open the door. He started talking about taking me to the mental hospital that very evening. At first I felt frightened by the prospect, but it swiftly occurred to me that this was a wonderful plan. He'd take me there, but they'd take one look at him and lock him up. Then they'd send me home and all would be well. My father was a good man in many ways. I've believed that more as the years have gone by. He was honest and sincere. He worked hard, and he worked long hours. I knew few evenings when he was not working at the dining table well into the evening. He tried, in his own way, to be kind, but he'd been severely crimped by circumstances. His first wife had had some backdoor man whilst he was away in World War II, and rather than face the ignominy of divorcing her, he let her divorce him for desertion. He paid for it for the rest of his life in alimony, as she never worked again. He never got over that, and it blighted his life. It occurred to me that blues might have helped him. He could have sung a song about it. My father's efforts towards correcting me socially were always thwarted by my apparently willful unwillingness to live in normal conceptual boxes. His ideas of acceptable and unacceptable were severely demarcated in ways that made no sense to me. I was always transgressing the unwritten law of how life was supposed to be. It would have been fine if we'd lived in the 1850s and 1860s, rather than the 1950s and 1960s, because there'd have been no lost time culture with which to contend. I imagine he must have seen society falling apart all around him. I imagine that he must have been frightened by what was happening, especially when the television began to allow my depraved row prime time. My father was keen on German composers, particularly Wagner. My mother's tastes were far wider. She encouraged him to listen to Mozart and Bach, but he always had a preference for the heavy melody line. He had recordings of Der Fliegende Holländer and others. After a while he accepted that I liked this music, but mainly because I'd learnt not to mention blues or Mr. Love. I was careful only to sing blues perched in one of the trees along the track at the back of our house, or in the woods. A woman once heard me and said, "That's a very sad song for a young boy to be singing." I told her, "It makes me happy to sing blues. It's my favourite music." She raised an eyebrow in that way that adults had. I never quite knew what that was supposed to mean. My mother used to like to hear me sing, especially Christmas carols. We'd sing carols every Sunday leading up to Christmas. We had an Advent wreath on the table that my father had made. It's a German custom to light a new candle on the wreath each Sunday until Christmas Eve. Graham and I would sit round the table with my mother and sing. I liked those carol singing times. They were occasions on which my father couldn't complain that I wasn't trying hard enough, or that I could do better. Singing was something at which I could excel. I had a loud voice and could hold a tune. It gave me great pleasure to see what joy it gave my mother to hear me sing, even though I'd rather have sung a Christmas blues. Life at the age of 8 seemed full of unanswered and unanswerable questions. Adult life was a big secret, an environment in which people were always too embarrassed to explain the salient features of what was going on. Letters arrived concerning legal matters, and although they were discussed at meal times, it was not permissible to ask questions. Strange accounts were given of my half-brother, James Vernon Simerson, who ran some sort of bingo hall in Streatham. He turned up one day, and there was an uncomfortable atmosphere. He had a wife called Edith, who had a strange smile. She had private thoughts behind her eyes, but she was nice enough. There were other mysteries too. Why did my parents no longer speak to Mrs. Barnaby up the road? She'd taken us to Farnham Theatre. I'd enjoyed it enormously. But my father had seen a play there that he considered offensive in some way. That was the end of that. What that play was, I never knew, because such things were not open to discussion. Confusing things kept happening. Mr. Love had disappeared. He was incommunicado in an institution, lost in a trackless waste of disinfected corridors. I was never to hear blues again, as far as I knew, so I had to sing whatever fragments I could remember. I knew I'd have to sing my fragments every day if I was not to forget them. I wrote down as much as I could, but my literary ability was not wonderful, and these jottings proved unsatisfactory. If I'd known what lay ahead, I would have asked Mr. Love's help in transcribing the songs I liked best. One morning, out of the blue, my father announced over breakfast that Mr. Love had died. The funeral had occurred the previous week. I hadn't even been able to attend his funeral. How desperately lonely and desolate that was. He'd been so kind to me, and I wasn't there for him at the end. This was misery beyond endurance. I burst into tears. "Stop this foolish nonsense immediately," my father barked. I ran into the woods and remained there the rest of the day. I was worried when I came home that I would be in serious trouble, but nothing was said. My mother made me some toast to eat in the kitchen, away from my father, who was working on papers in the dining room. The grief of a 10-year-old for an elderly, shell-shocked fellow down the road, who was not even a relative, was not considered worthy of the inconvenience of a drive to Brockwood. The disturbance it might cause to everyday life made it unthinkable to anyone apart from my mother, and she was to have no say in the matter. She seemed sad and morally affronted that there had been no attendees at the funeral. It was evident to me that she was displeased with my father. She told me that she understood how I felt, because they did things differently in Germany. "Mr. Love is in heaven now, and he knows you wanted to be there at his funeral." In heaven, according to my mother, you knew things like that. Well, maybe that was true, I thought. but I'd rather he'd gone to hell, so that I'd meet him again and we could play blues together. Mr. Love said he would leave his records to me. He knew I would look after them. Now what's going to happen to them? I said, not expecting an answer. It wasn't a question, just something I wanted to say. My mother looked tearful and said, "If Mr. Love wanted you to have them, he will have mentioned it in his will." "A will?" "Ja, Victor. That is a legal document in which you say where you want your possessions to go after you are dead. If Mr. Love made a will and wanted you to have his records, then someone will let us know." What she didn't say was that my father would never have blues records in the house and would therefore not receive them. My mother told me that discussion of the matter was out of the question. Blues was a corrupting influence, according to my father, and it must be so because the BBC had banned it. I was not to know the truth of the matter for almost a decade. Several months after the death of Mr. Love, it became evident that he hadn't made a will, or at least that he hadn't had time to revise it in my favour. He probably fell apart emotionally when his sister died, and it must have been the last thing on his mind. The letter never arrived, and of course there was no way to find out what happened to the parts of his estate that no one wanted. Who'd want a pile of old 78s? I went to bed and stared into the dark until, by default, I merged into it.